let's linger for a moment on the Disney acquisition of Lucasfilm. When we were promised a Star Wars sequel trilogy, well, a lot of us were overwhelmed with anticipation. But for some, the first red flag came on April 25th, 2014, when Lucasfilm announced that the entirety of the Star Wars expanded universe, all of the comics, novels, and video games, which included extensive lore about the events following Return of the Jedi, all of it had been decanonized, and would now be referred to as Legends, while Disney would invent new original content to replace it, which would henceforth be deemed official canon. And then 2015 hit, and The Force Awakens came out. And at the time, I'll admit I liked it. I mean, was it pretty disappointing to be sitting there in the theater and realize that the filmmakers trusted their audience so little that they had decided to force the movie into the shape of a painfully predictable remake of the original film? Yes. That was a bummer. Did it suck that by killing off Han Solo so weirdly, we were never going to see our trio of beloved heroes from the original trilogy together again, not even for a second? Yes. Was Starkiller Base somehow bigger but far more boring than the original 2 Death Stars? God, yes, it all felt so safe and lazy. But there was enough going on in that film to hold us over, at least, until better, more meaningful installments in the story came along. And then the sequel came out in 2017. The Last Jedi hit theaters, and by the time I looked up to catch my breath and get my bearings, everything had changed, and the landscape of nerddom was unrecognizable. But I'll be honest here. I did like The Last Jedi on that first viewing in the theater. I mean, I really wanted to like it going in. In fact, I wanted to like it so badly because I was really hoping that it was going to redeem some of the issues I had with The Force Awakens. That is to say, I thought that Episode 8 was going to do what Episode 7 could not, and tell a unique and original story set in the Star Wars galaxy, instead of resorting to occupying that nebulous middle ground between remake, reboot, and sequel that actually just constitutes profound laziness and lack of vision on the part of the filmmakers. Among things I thought we were going to see based on how the marketing set expectations, I thought that Rey was actually going to go dark and wrestle with the dark side of the Force. I thought that Luke was going to go full Gandalf the Grey and give us some proper bearded space wizard action, while also educating us about more of the history and lore of the Jedi that we were already aware of. And at the very least, I thought Snoke would be explored as an intriguingly mysterious villain. But at the very least, we were going to see Luke grieve the death of Han Solo. That's an easy emotional slam dunk from the filmmakers, right? Right? And Captain Phasma was gonna do something and reveal the face that we knew was hiding behind that chrome helmet. Right?
Every word of what you just said was wrong.
But that's not what we got. We got a film that seemed to be at war with the very story it belonged to and had sprung from. It was a film that felt like it was engineered to divide a fandom, and divide a fandom it did. Suddenly the messaging we were getting from the studio that made the latest chapter of our favorite thing, suddenly that messaging was all tribal and divisive, separating people along lines of gender and race. It was hard not to feel attacked while watching scenes like this.
I came to this island to die.
I mean, Yoda was a swamp hermit on Dagobah, sure. And Obi-Wan Kenobi, in his old age, had become a desert hermit on Tatooine. On paper, it makes sense that Luke would become an island hermit on Ahch-To. But then we get a line like this.
I came to this island to die.
Yoda and Obi-Wan were both living in exile, yes, and they had both fallen from grace. But when they appear in the original trilogy, they are both enchanting and whimsical space wizards. Luke here in The Last Jedi is not that. He is completely defeated. He's given up entirely. He is effectively suicidal. This couldn't help but feel like a slap in the face to fans who hold Luke Skywalker as kind of an icon of heroism. It felt cruel, and it felt uncalled for. Also, I will always maintain that The Last Jedi did Laura Dern dirty.
I've dealt with plenty of trigger-happy flyboys like you.
I love Laura Dern, and she deserved better than this. Suddenly we, the nerds, who love to deconstruct our favorite stories, who love debating granular details of obscure story worlds, suddenly we found the discourse poisoned. Good faith criticism of a movie like The Last Jedi was often labeled as quote-unquote bigoted, mainly sexist or racist. I mean, check out what comic book writer Cambria Pratt has to say about her experience as a longtime Star Wars fan in this opinion piece she wrote on Pirates and Princesses. Pratt also goes by the moniker Geeky Sparkles on the YouTube channel Clownfish TV. Pratt outlines her decades as a devoted Star Wars fan, writing, "I remember boys and girls playing with the toys. I remember both boys and girls talking about the movies, going to the movies, being obsessed with the movies. However, I do admit it's always been predominantly boys. Girls and women have been fans since day one." Pratt also discusses her love for the Extended Universe books. "During all this time," she writes, "I still had not faced any pushback, negativity, or bad behavior for being a female fan. Same thing when the prequels came out. Went to see them, the last two with my husband, and there were women and men there. No issues." And then, when she saw The Last Jedi, Pratt expressed some disappointment about the film, and she writes, "I had men telling me that I was a misogynist because I didn't like the film. I was told I wasn't a real fan, and I didn't fundamentally understand Luke Skywalker. Terms like racist were thrown at me, even though I had zero issue with characters like Finn or Rose. I just thought they were done poorly. Also, the leads were white and straight, but I was the ist and phobe for not loving them. Then I started seeing these headlines on blogs calling out toxic fans and man babies for not liking the latest Star Wars film. People started saying that women were finally allowed to be fans, yet they always were." It was a really unfortunate combination of factors, wasn't it? Nerds, by their very nature, are driven to dissect stories. Nerds are the people who watch trailers frame by frame and pore over literary passages word by word and write lengthy interpretations of seemingly trivial but actually deeply meaningful details of the mise-en-scène of their favorite films. But an attempt to take this nerdy, granular approach to The Last Jedi often resulted in nerds coming up against brazen world-building inconsistencies and illogical creative decisions, if not outright lazy storytelling decisions. And if you're a fan of The Last Jedi, then first of all, thanks for watching. I hope you don't hate me, but please answer me this question now. What were Luke Skywalker's 3 lessons to Rey? I mean, the film depicts the first 2 lessons quite clearly, and there's some pretty interesting stuff in there between Rey and Luke, but the 3rd lesson is missing, which raises some interesting philosophical questions like, is Luke Skywalker's bizarre demeanor throughout the film actually the secret 3rd lesson? Was it all a performance, a false facade of defeat and depression to incite Rey to action and triumph? Or is this the 3rd lesson?
It's a tribe from a neighboring island. They come here once a month to raid and plunder the caretaker's village.
Come on, we've got to stop them.
Do you know what a true Jedi Knight would do right now? Nothing. That burn inside you, that anger thinking what the raiders are going to do, the books in the Jedi library say ignore that. Only act when you can maintain balance.
raid and plunder.
In a way.
Was this a joke?
Sorry, I didn't think you just ran so fast.
I thought they were in danger. I was trying to do something.
And that's what the Resistance needs, not some old failed husk of a religion.
Why was Luke's third lesson to Rey contained in a deleted scene that was not deemed fit to be included in the film's final cut? Are we then to conclude that Luke's third lesson to Rey is something else that he does in the film? If so, what? The film leaves it completely up in the air in a way that might seem rather intellectually ambiguous at first, until you see this deleted scene, and you realize that the filmmakers just didn't have a plan. Or they just didn't care that Luke teaching Rey 3 lessons was something that the film set up pretty clearly in the first act. I mean, Anton Chekhov would have been so pissed. Same with the scene of Luke grieving Han's death. Why was that cut? I think a lot of people interpreted nerds as being offended by the creative decisions of The Last Jedi, when for a lot of nerds the opportunity to get truly offended wasn't even there. Because what we were being shown just couldn't stand on its own 2 legs story-wise, and didn't make internal sense, or any sense in context of the grander Star Wars saga. It wasn't being offended so much as being totally baffled and bewildered, and then ultimately disappointed. It was a movie that seemed designed to frustrate the nerd, as some misguided form of revenge for some perceived past slight. But if The Last Jedi was meant as a kind of cruel fuck you to the fans, a slap to the face, then The Rise of Skywalker was actually meant to break the fandom. I mean, even the actors were unable to mask their disappointment. Look at Oscar Isaac's eyes in this scene. He's a phenomenal actor in many other things, including in his portrayal of Duke Leto Atreides in Dune Part 1. But here we can see that even an actor of his caliber is unable to mask his disdain for the Rise of Skywalker script.
It confirms the worst. Somehow Palpatine returned.
Somehow Palpatine returned. That's gotta be the single laziest line I've ever seen in a professional, big-budget Hollywood blockbuster. They could have substituted that line for something like this. Poe, we've received a transmission from one of our last spies in the Outer Rim. The rumors are true. The signal is legitimate. It's really him. Finn, but that means the dark side. Rey. It's so much more powerful than we ever could have imagined. Rose. What are you saying? That voice could have been anyone. Probably some First Order Tarkin wannabe like Hux. They're trying to scare us into surrender. You don't actually believe Poe. We all heard that voice, didn't we? We all felt it. Come on, Rose. Quit lying to yourself. We know the truth. It's the real thing. We're out of time. Palpatine is back. The Rise of Skywalker is a movie that backtracks on almost every questionable yet undeniably bold creative decision made in The Last Jedi. Seriously, Rey is revealed to be the granddaughter of Palpatine, not the daughter of nameless junk traders, as was revealed to her by Kylo Ren in The Last Jedi. Luke tells Rey the following.
Jedi's weapon deserves more respect.
In a direct contradiction of his actions in The Last Jedi. Kelly Marie Tran's Rose Tico is barely in The Rise of Skywalker at all, whereas she was introduced as one of the main characters in The Last Jedi. A film in which she doesn't really have character development so much as she just completely flips on her principles in the third act. But Rose Tico was certainly a welcome member of the team, and a great charismatic addition to the Star Wars cast. And they just brutally sidelined her in the third film. I find that creative decision despicable, and so unfair to Kelly Marie Tran. Because honestly, I was hoping to see much more of Rose in The Rise of Skywalker, in part because I thought she deserved better, more consistent characterization than she got in The Last Jedi. But nope, She was basically written out of the film, save for a handful of expository lines that may as well have been given to a background character. Kylo Ren smashes his helmet in The Last Jedi, but reforges it in The Rise of Skywalker. The Holdo maneuver, which consists of driving a ship kamikaze style at light speed into an enemy ship, is stated in The Rise of Skywalker to be a 1 in a million chance.
We need to put some Holdo maneuvers. Do some real damage.
Come on, that move is 1 in a million.
But in my opinion, that's just a cheap, meaningless shout-out to A New Hope.
Great shot, kid! That was 1 in a million!
'Cause, you know, in A New Hope, despite the odds, the rebellion still sends out an entire squadron of light fighters in an attempt to pull this off. By comparison, what The Last Jedi presents is nonsensical, both in the context of its own movie and in the way that The Rise of Skywalker recontextualizes it. Why wouldn't both the Resistance and the First Order attempt this maneuver all the time with droids piloting light spacecraft, or even with spacecraft on autopilot? The writers of The Rise of Skywalker clearly realized that this was a problem, because they included the line about it being a 1 in a million chance.
We need to put some Holdo maneuvers. Do some real damage.
Come on, that move is 1 in a million.
But then, if it is 1 in a million, then how does Holdo's character and the entire third act of The Last Jedi make any sense? The Holdo maneuver consists of Admiral Holdo gambling the survival of the Resistance on a 1 in a million shot, which, if she misses, which has a 99.9999% chance, the Resistance transports will be completely unprotected from enemy fire, and the enemy will be totally unharmed and free to pick off the Resistance at will. So Admiral Holdo spends most of her screen time in the film admonishing characters like Poe for being reckless, then commits the most reckless act of all?
I've dealt with plenty of trigger-happy flyboys like you.
Do you see what I mean when I call it incoherent? But you know, this doesn't look like a 1 in a million shot to me. It looks like a bullseye. So what is it, Disney? Why is it 1 in a million? Was it because Holdo's ship was bigger than a certain threshold size, which would make the maneuver worth it? Was it because the timing had to be incredibly precise? The ship would have to hit the enemy ship at a specific point of accelerating to light speed, but before properly reaching light speed? So Holdo found herself in a unique position to execute such an attack? I don't know. I would need to work out some robust headcanon in order to totally square this with the mechanics of the Star Wars galaxy. And I can do that. And as a fan, I'm usually willing to. For example, my headcanon for Revenge of the Sith is that Palpatine used the Force to murder Padme, explaining why she loses the will to live. And then afterwards, Palpatine used her stolen life force to resurrect Darth Vader in his cyborg suit. To me, that headcanon improves an element of Revenge of the Sith which I was never quite satisfied with. And Revenge of the Sith is built in such a way that it is easy for me to formulate my headcanon which corrects it. With The Last Jedi, by comparison, the headcanon I have to come up with to justify narrative inconsistencies and bizarre storytelling decisions is extensive and intricate, and I have to whip it out for virtually every single scene in the film. I just can't square any of that with the world-building rules of the Star Wars galaxy. And look, despite all this, I enjoyed The Last Jedi on the big screen the first time I saw it. What can I say? The creative decisions in the film felt bold and startling, which was what I wanted after the corrosive safeness of The Force Awakens. And The Last Jedi looks gorgeous. I think the cinematography in it is excellent. I also think it contains John Williams' best work for Disney Star Wars. Plus, I go into these movies wanting to like them, and I'm usually willing to forgive some inconsistencies or incongruities in the script if the movie provides something suitably epic, magical, and extraordinary. Take Pirates of the Caribbean: At World's End, an undeniably flawed film that, despite its flaws, still moves me in my soul and provides new layers of world-building richness every time I rewatch it.
What? You've seen it all, done it all. You survived. That's the trick, isn't it? To survive.
It's not just about living forever, Jackie. The trick is living with yourself forever.
To me, a movie's true value is found in the rewatch. A genuinely excellent film is one that improves upon repeat viewings, its story world deepening, more creative layers unfolding, and the characters' actions so richly drawn and so interesting that they can be analyzed from a fresh angle with every repeat viewing. But that means that spectacle and gorgeous visuals are never enough to make a film truly great, except on that first intoxicating viewing in the theater. As Jim Emerson writes in this essay for RogerEbert.com, one reason for reviewing is to get closer and deeper into films or filmmakers whose work we already feel a strong degree of comfort and familiarity with. These are works whose cinephilic pleasure is more or less assured. Our previous, pre-existing response to the work is not likely to be seriously questioned, but these repeat visits are nevertheless valuable. They take us further, each time, into the work and its constituent details, its very molecular structure, allowing us a greater intimacy and thus fluency in thinking and talking about it. Hell, the last time I rewatched Attack of the Clones was last year, and I was grinning with happiness throughout the whole thing. The 6 films comprising the Star Wars original trilogy and prequel trilogy do this for me. Even Rogue One does this for me. But the Star Wars sequel trilogy, well, where I'm concerned, they just fall apart, and they don't even feel like actual movies to me. I mean, what's the point of ever rewatching The Force Awakens if A, it tells the same story as A New Hope, but it's not quite as impactful and feels way less fresh, and B, The Last Jedi undermines almost every creative decision made in The Force Awakens. Who's Snoke? Doesn't matter. Luke's wizardly appearance at the end of The Force Awakens? Undermined within 30 seconds of screen time in The Last Jedi. Who are the Knights of Ren? If only the filmmakers knew. And what about Finn's Stormtrooper past? Well, Finn will act like he doesn't even remember it.
That's one hell of a pilot!
Speaking of Finn, what about this? Finn doesn't get to do anything on this level ever again in the trilogy, not in The Last Jedi or in The Rise of Skywalker. Seriously. Remember this moment from the trailer for The Force Awakens?
The dark side. A Jedi.
I mean, talk about broken promises. And it goes further, too. What's the point of watching The Last Jedi when The Rise of Skywalker is then going to go and walk back every interesting creative decision in The Last Jedi? This is not a trilogy that builds upon itself. It's a trilogy that trips over itself at every turn. Every installment in this trilogy resents the other installments, and when it hits its climax, 3 movies worth of build-up, I felt nothing.
I am all the Sith.
I'm all the Jedi.
Okay, 2 lightsabers is enough to overcome the power of the dark side? Was that the secret all along? God damn it, Disney, it's just not good enough when compared to Luke and Vader dueling each other for each other's souls in Return of the Jedi. Or the years of fraternity and mentorship exploding in an epic duel between friends as close as brothers in Revenge of the Sith. By comparison, the Star Wars sequel trilogy is hollow. Disney took Star Wars, a story with so much feeling, and they made it empty. They took the expansive setting of a galaxy far, far away, and they made it feel so much smaller than it ever had felt before. Rey is not a comparable character to Luke or Anakin. She doesn't wrestle with anything on the level that they do. The closest she comes to falling to the dark side is looking at it.
I want you to join me. We can rule together and bring a new order to the galaxy.
Don't do this, Ben.
I mean, what is that? She doesn't wrestle with it at all. She doesn't even think twice about her response to Kylo Ren. Compare that to Luke, who actually succumbs to the dark side and tries to strike Palpatine down, only to be blocked by Vader. Or compare it to Vader, who basically has an entire 6-movie saga devoted to the tragedy of his fall and later his prophesied redemption. So at the end of the day, the Star Wars sequel trilogy was probably the single biggest disappointment of my nerdy life. I can't really see myself rewatching them in the future, let alone adding them to the Star Wars marathon. In fact, my headcanon for them is simply that they are not canon. So, you could chalk all of this up to the Star Wars sequel trilogy just being a series of bad movies. An incompetently made rush job by a creative team that tried to do good work, but was totally hamstrung by meddling, risk-averse executives, and one blind-siding, real-life tragedy. But I think it's fair to take it further. I think that The Rise of Skywalker is not just a bad movie. I think it's a malicious one. Because when you look at the messaging coming from the Disney Lucasfilm executives, well, it's clear that they view the Star Wars fandom as inherently reprehensible. Seriously, they speak of the group of people who comprise the Star Wars fandom as their enemies. So it's pretty evident, to me at least, that the people who were charged with making Star Wars in the 2010s believe that if someone is a fan of older Star Wars, the original trilogy or the prequel trilogy, then that person is hateful and deserves to be made to feel bad. So when I look back on The Rise of Skywalker, I can't help but be convinced that Lucasfilm felt like that quality of film was exactly what Star Wars fans deserved, in return for being fans of the original material. Remember that The Force Awakens begins with this line.
This will begin to make things right.
Under Disney, Lucasfilm has always been about dishonoring the past.
Let the past die. Kill it, if you have to.
It's clear that they think they're doing the right thing by, in their words, killing the past. And that's where it goes beyond frustrating for me, into the truly infuriating. And it's not just Disney that's doing it. Nowadays, the mainstream narrative about nerd culture, and nerds in general, is that the tradition of nerddom has always been one that celebrated and encouraged the most hateful and regressive ideologies of our time.
You know, suddenly we're being put in a position where we are able to move forward, you know, and we are seen and we are heard and we are acknowledged as having a right to be here as much as anybody else.
Like, only someone who is not a nerd could possibly think that this is news. That black women are welcome in the Lord of the Rings fandom. And look, I'll take the point that before now there were no black women in any of the cinematic adaptations of the Middle-earth saga. But the problem with going down that rabbit hole is that any given story can be accused of failing to include or represent someone.
It's a cast and a Danish production, which is entirely Nordic. It therefore has some lack of diversity, you would say, as also new rules are implied in Hollywood.
What are you on to?
Sorry, but
from the get-go.
From the get-go, there is set some rules of diversity across the Atlantic for competing in the best picture, the equivalent to this competition. As I see it, you don't live up to these standards with this broadcast, and there is just curious, it's not because of artistic reasons, it's because of lack of diversity that this can't compete in that competition. Are you worried about that?
Are you?
There's always going to be someone who's part of the human tapestry who wasn't included. That is a consequence of how diverse the human race really is. It is actually something to celebrate. All right. I think it's time for me to get a little personal here because I think it is relevant for what we are talking about. I am, for lack of a better term, a person of color. I'm a brown man. My mother is an immigrant from the Caribbean. She was born in Trinidad, and my father is Jewish Canadian. I've never seen a character on screen who was half Caribbean, half Jewish. And I've never needed to see that. That has never been a barrier to me feeling included in these fandoms and communities. The reason that I'm included in those communities is because I am a nerd. Because I am passionate about these subjects, about this lore, and about this world building. It has nothing to do with the color of my skin or my ethnic background. That's just my 2 cents. But take it from a mixed race guy. Nerddom has always been welcoming to us. But that's not the narrative that we're seeing now in the mainstream. Now, the narrative is that nerds, by dint of loving these old stories, are insurmountably old-fashioned in our thinking, to the point of being deeply sexist, racist, homophobic, transphobic, etc. Suddenly, we nerds were an audience that needed to be educated out of our regressive ways, the furthest thing from an audience whose sensibilities any reasonable person would want to cater to. I mean, why would any decent person cater to a bigot? But what's so infuriating about that is that it's simply incorrect that nerddom has been a place where bigotry has traditionally been at home. It is a factually mistaken assessment of what nerd culture has always been about. And all a person would need to do to educate themselves out of such an ignorant opinion is to actually go and read, watch, or listen to some of that old school, nerdy content. So, when we see those reductive, ignorant arguments being disseminated online, it boils our blood. For a great many of us, it can't help but put us on the defensive. Because it reveals that these people claiming the problematic nature of nerddom never even bothered to watch these things, which they now feel justified in criticizing or worse, altering or censoring. And they certainly never enjoyed those things, never cherished or loved them the way we do. People from outside of the nerd community now feel entitled to ruin things within the nerd community, a community which they have no intention of ever becoming a part of. And they do this because they have their facts wrong. Because they have been led to believe that nerddom equals bigot fantasy, which they are able to believe because they have never engaged meaningfully with the bulk of nerdy content anyway.